Okay. Hello. Uh, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and get started with our Symposium 1. So welcome to Symposium 1, How Can Cognitive Psychologists Ease the Spread of Misinformation and Boost the Spread of Accurate Information in Education? Before I introduce the speaker lineup for this symposium, I wanted to give a bit of brief background on what motivated us to organize this symposium at this particular point in time. We were motivated in part by the reality that cognitive psychology research often fails to impact practice in educational settings. Some glaring examples of this are the overselling of learning styles inventories in US education and the underselling of spaced effort. As probably everybody in this room is aware, learning styles is the idea that there are different types of learners, such as auditory or visual or kinesthetic learners. And as everyone in this room probably also knows, there is no scientific support for this idea of learning styles. And it's not for lack of trying on the part of cognitive psychologists. Cognitive psychologists have actually been doing research on this and speaking out about it for many years. So just as some examples of papers that have tried to make this point, this is an article from 2008 by Pashler and colleagues making this point. This is an article by Willingham and colleagues from 2015 making this point. And this is a more recent chapter from the past few years that's also making this point. And these are just a few examples. There are many other papers out there. There are YouTube videos. There are cognitive psychologists blogging out there. Cognitive psychologists have been very outspoken about this idea that learning styles is not backed by science. Yet, learning styles continues to be commonplace, and learning styles inventories in US education. And perhaps a humorous example of this is shown here. This was a Twitter conversation, back when it was Twitter, among cognitive psychologists, talking about how a cognitive psychologist's daughter came home with the results of a learning styles inventory, telling her what her learning style was and what type of career she should pursue given this learning style. Unfortunately, this is not really a rare example. I'm sure many people in this room have had a very similar experience to this or know someone who's had a very similar experience to this. I know I've had this exact experience with my son coming home with the results of a learning styles inventory from school. So we can ask the question, why won't society listen to cognitive psychologists about learning styles? Well, in pondering this question, some of my colleagues and I wondered, could learning styles be a case of misinformation spread? When we think of misinformation, which is a big topic right now in cognitive psychology, including at this conference, we tend to think of things like vaccine hesitation, or climate change denial, or political news. But perhaps learning styles is also a case of misinformation. And if so, perhaps we should turn to research on reducing misinformation spread for ideas about how we can get the word out to educators and our educational system that learning styles is not where our investment should be in education. So along these lines, my colleague Dan Robinson and I published this paper in the Journal of Social Issues this year, where we made the case that the concept of learning styles has the kinds of qualities that seem to characterize easy spread of information across people and information that sticks in people's minds. And unfortunately, the kinds of scientifically supported methods like spacing are the opposite. They don't tend to spread easily or stick in people's minds. So that is perhaps one issue. At the same time, cognitive psychologists should not oversell implementations of laboratory findings that have not yet been tested in the wild of classroom settings. So as this author makes the point in an important report in the UK, he argues many of the classroom approaches inspired by cognitive science are promising, and knowledge of cognitive science is an important part of understanding how pupils learn. There is, however, much more work to be done to understand in which context findings from the basic science are applicable and effective in everyday classroom conditions and how these can be implemented. So on that note, I'm happy to introduce the lineup of speakers for today's symposium, How Can Cognitive Psychologists Ease the Spread of Misinformation and Boost the Spread of Accurate Information in Education? Our first talk is Why Fuzzy Trace Theory is Necessary and Not Just Nice in Understanding and Resisting Misinformation by Valerie Reyna. Coming up after that, we have Growth Mindset, Separating Myth from Reality by Alexander Bourgoin. After that, we have Educational Psychology, Information and Misinformation, Does Methodology Matter? By Dan Robinson. Then turning to how we can ensure that as cognitive psychologists, we're promoting accurate information out there to the public and to educators. We have Boundaries, Generalizability, and Translating Science to Educational Practice by Ben Motes. And then we'll be ending with my own talk, Smartwatch Learning Reinforcements in the Wild, using the Terracotta tool to rigorously examine a real-world classroom practice implementation. And so with that, we'll have our first speaker, Dr. Valerie Reyna, come up.
Thank you so much. Should I wait for the, yeah, you can, there we go. All right. I can see it. Can they, no, there we go. You can see it too, good. All right. So here's a quick overview. Fuzzy trace theory integrates prior approaches, System 1 and System 2, but goes beyond System 1 and System 2 in explaining how to understand and resist misinformation, understand its effects. It explains belief spread and resistance to misinformation. It distinguishes gist representations, the essence or meaning of information, from the facts, the surface form of that information. Its mechanisms generalize across disciplines, and I want to draw attention to a beautiful paper by Cleary and Robinson. She's going to talk about this a little bit later, I think, in the Journal of Social Issues. She said some of the things I'm going to say about fuzzy trace theory, perhaps better than I'm going to, and a lot of other things to boot. Research from our lab clarifies when education is protective. I'm going to present just a few slides on that. It is basically defines the prior as a framework, an ideational framework. It explains how humans and artificial intelligence spread misinformation, undermining trust. And it identifies differing mental representations, verbatim and gist, that people take away from the same message. And it demonstrates, and this is a reanalysis of some of the data presented in an earlier session on Costello et al. 2024. For the first time here, we're going to show how we analyze the conversations in which AI debunked conspiracy theories by analyzing whether the active ingredient was a gist argument or a verbatim argument. And those results are coming. And then finally, messages that promote gist-based processing are shared, remembered, and believed and acted on more than those that do not, and interventions that change the gist, that essentially change what makes sense. Not just what is true, not just what we're motivated to believe, but what makes sense. All right. Is it possible to put the slides on both of the presentation screens above? That would be excellent. So it clarifies when education is protective. For example, beautiful. Why is it that antibiotics do not work for HIV or for HPV? It's the V part, right? It's the fact that they're viruses and not bacteria. So that's a background scientific knowledge that if you know that, then it makes sense that antibiotics would not be protective. So this is part of why education matters in determining what makes sense. Not simply a fact that you retrieve that then debunks the misinformation, but it makes the misinformation seem implausible. All right. Fuzzy trace theory and gist explains how misinformation spreads, and this is a lovely paper by Broniatowski et al., in which they looked at how information spread after the outbreak of measles at Disneyland. And they had M-Turkers code a whole bunch of messages on Facebook, posts on Facebook, into whether they had statistics in them, whether they in fact conveyed a gist, positive or negative, whether they had a story or anecdote, and whether they had a photo in them. And in fact, the big odds ratio on the right is the presence of gist. That was the most strongly predictive of whether at least one share occurred. This is a logistic regression. Also, statistics independently increase the probability of sharing information. Stories did not, because even though that bar is a little about the same size as statistics, it may be a little larger, the variance was high enough that it was not significant. But the conclusion from the study was that stories do make a difference as long as they convey the gist. And once you enter gist as a predictor, story drops out as significant. And also pictures are helpful too. So fuzzy trace theory distinguishes two kinds of ways of thinking. There's thinking about the verbatim details, the specific information, the literal claims, what's literally true, technically true. It's more concrete, and it's easier to falsify. The gist, on the other hand, is the general meaning of that piece of information or misinformation. It's the broader point. It's more abstract, and it's harder to falsify. It's a little fuzzy. All right. So if you think about gist plausibility versus literal thinking, according to fuzzy trace theory, people mainly base judgments. They process the verbatim, they process it in parallel, and sometimes it makes a difference. It's kind of an unnatural habit of thought. Gist-based processing is a natural habit of thought. And it has to do with the meaning of the information. And this implies that gist plausibility is an entering wedge in shaping thought. And I'll show you some data. So this is some wonderful data, not by me, but by other people who've used fuzzy trace theory. Langdon, Helgeson, Chi, and Efron have this beautiful paper, and the title is called, "It's Not Literally True, But You Get the Gist." So, and then also I'm going to present some data that's not even published yet by Beth Helgeson that she presented at SESP, taking the in-group seriously, that's the gist, but the out-group literally, that's the verbatim. So if you think of this claim, for example, this was an actual claim by Kamala Harris. Donald Trump left us the worst unemployment rate since the Great Depression. Well, this turns out to be a false statement. Now, Helgeson presented both false statements and true statements, and also false statements that were consistent with Republican points of view and those that were consistent with Democratic point of view. So I'm only going to present half of the story, but it's symmetrical. So what happens there? Well, you know, is this true or false? Explain your answer. Well, when those were answered, please explain your answer, Democrats said, well, a detail was wrong. Kamala got a detail wrong. But the general sentiment was still true, right? And then another person said, it's not totally accurate, obviously, but I think she was trying to make a point, and either intentionally or unintentionally made somewhat of an inaccurate statement while doing so. And then a third Democratic kind of gloss on truth here was she was making a general statement about how high the rate of unemployment had gotten during Trump's presidency. The Republicans here say, this is just not true. This is a lie, it's a blatant lie, and what she said is not true and proven. So those flip if you just do a statement from the other side of the political coin. So what is just plausibility? So what we've talked about so far, it's not about what's true or false necessarily, although naturally it influences what you think is true or false, so it's not totally independent, but it's conceptually distinct. It's not about agreement pro-con necessarily, but again, it's what makes sense. And if your agreement about what's pro-con changes your worldview, then what makes sense changes as well. So we had people do something where we had a number of statements where they rated them from completely far-fetched, 1 to 7 makes complete sense. And that's the gist plausibility scale I'm going to be talking about. And here's a couple of concrete examples. On the left, you have the plausibility examples. The government would intentionally poison people. Is that far-fetched, or does that make complete sense to you? Those are the average ratings of 3 different groups of subjects, students, community members, and a vaccine-hesitant sample that we recruited. That's not a 1. That's a 2.52, up as high as a 3.1 on a 1 to 7 scale for the vaccine hesitant. It made a little bit of sense, or wasn't completely far-fetched. Another statement would be scientists would routinely conduct drug experiments on people without their consent. I hope none of you are doing that. Anyway, 2.91, et cetera, et cetera. There are also items about the deep state, about COVID, about the FDA, but the Cronbach's alpha here was incredibly high. I tried to pick some comparable ones. The conspiracy scale is the Brotherton et al. Scale. It's an amazing scale. That is whether you, in fact, agree that these are true, the government is involved in the murder of innocent citizens, and so on. And those agreements were also pretty high. So the 16-item GIST plausibility scale had a 0.90 to 0.92 reliability. Brotherton, that's the conspiracy scale, 0.94 to 0.95. We invented an AI trust scale. It was remarkably, I trust AI as a source of information. I rely on it. I think it's trustworthy, so on and so forth. There's also our System 2 measures, like the objective numeracy scale. That's an objective math performance scale. The cognitive reflection task, this was a 6-item version, and a 20-item task, Martins et al., called the misinformation susceptibility test, that has fake and real news headlines on it, that has amazing psychometric validation, representative samples, multiple countries, et cetera, and so forth. So a preview of the results. The generic conspiracy beliefs reflect polarization. The COVID-19 and GIST plausibility predicts conspiracy beliefs. It predicts vaccine hesitancy, and it predicts misinformation discernment, telling those fake from real headlines. Effects were found for students, effects were found for community members, effects were found for vaccine hesitant sample, and effects were found for prolific samples as well. And this is all controlling for some of the variables people have talked about earlier today. That's controlling for demographics, political bias, trust in science, trust in the media, trust in AI, and System 2 predictors like the cognitive reflection test and the objective numeracy score. So a little data. GIST plausibility was surprisingly high. You see, these are independent tests because we wanted to give the conspiracy scale a chance here. If you put them in together, plausibility outpredicts it. But it is significant. It's just smaller in magnitude. That's for a single item. And as you can see, all the samples, the 467 students, the 777 community members, and the 254 vaccine hesitant people. Remarkable level of agreement. It predicts generic conspiracy in all of the samples. These are basically just different variations on a theme. It's the same data with swapping out trust in science versus trust in the media because they correlated so highly, swapping out ideology for political parties. So if you just process one of them, you processed all of them. And all 3 samples, and those were separate analyses, we had a significant prediction of GIST plausibility predicting your conspiratorial thinking. It also predicted your planning to vaccinate for COVID, your wanting to vaccinate for COVID, your willingness to vaccinate if it was easy to do, and your willingness to vaccinate if it was safe and effective. Easy and affordable, safe and effective. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 pairs of analyses there. And again, those are separate analyses with conspiracy predicting in blue and GIST plausibility predicting in black. They're all significant predictors of whether you, in fact, are going to plan, want, are willing to vaccinate, but GIST plausibility outpredicts conspiracy theories. Again, this is the hesitant. Now, that was the community sample, so this is the hesitant sample. Same story, a little bit, smaller sample. The 2 on the right, willingness if safe and effective, are not significant, but still you see the superiority of the GIST plausibility scale for planning, wanting, and willing to vaccinate. Then what about values? Well, there's just representations, and then this is a memory model, really, at its core. Shout out to the previous talks in this very room. I hope the karma is still here. So there is, when you represent information a certain way, that's a memory cue. And that causes you to retrieve things that are important to making decisions, like your core values. So your core values might be the government needs to save lives, or the government should keep its hands off my body. And what I wanted to show here is that often we share core values across the political spectrum, left wing and right wing. But we construe the gist of decisions differently so that our values apply differently to those decisions. So this is kind of a provocative slide. I hope people are interested in it later. But the gist of the information differs. So if you take the same data I presented to you earlier and you put in people's agreement with these core values, that's just principles of freedom, keep your hands off my body kind of values, and then the just principles of social responsibility. It's like kindergarten level, right? It's a bad idea to hurt other people. That's how we worded it, and people agreed with that, and it significantly predicted their, predicted their COVID vaccine wanting. This is just one of the analyses. This is after allowing all the other predictors to take up all the variants. This is in model 2. And also just plausibility continued to uniquely predict additional variants in addition to your core values, your political biases, your trust in the media or in science, and so on and so forth. What about discerning misinformation? Now this again is that 20-item scale with the 10 fake items and the 10 real items, and it's your ability to, your essentially correctness. Do you identify true as true and false as false? It is, in fact, correctness. So our model, which we talked about in an article called The Psychology of Misinformation Across the Lifespan, open access, introduced a framework in which we talked about a number of things: just plausibility, system 2 predictors, because we do think they're right, they're just not everything, right? And then AI trust, that 4-item AI trust scale I mentioned to you. And the negative signs there mean the more you trust in AI. Now, AI can be good. We talked about that earlier, how AI can help you debunk conspiracy theories. It's just a tool. But overall, does your willingness to rely on an outsourced cognition, essentially, does that make you more or less susceptible to misinformation and other things? We thought there were reasons to believe that people might be more susceptible to misinformation. So negatively predicted your discernment here. Right? So in fact, the data show that. If you put AI trust in, and you put in, that's actually negative predictors there, and just plausibility, they both predict in student samples and in prolific samples. Again, those bars are independent analyses. And the objective numeracy scale also predicts. So that is in fact a prediction made in an earlier session. Gord, you're right. It does predict your ability to discern independently of just plausibility, but all of those are correct, and just plausibility has the greatest weight. If you just take the same analysis and you swap in this, the cognitive reflection test, the 6-item version, once again, the CRT predicts, but the just plausibility predicts independently and carries greater weight. And AI trust, once again, is a negative predictor. You're more susceptible to misinformation, less able to discern it when you trust AI. So finally, if you put in political bias to the same analyses, again, that independently predicts, but AI trust is significant. I think one of the predictors fell out because AI trust and trust in general is related a little to political party. Just plausibility continues to predict. Discernment, real and fake discernment, and the CRT independently predicts. Also, and this is the data I was promising you, we think that the Costello et al. Debunking, the active ingredient in that was a just kind of appeal of just plausibility and just explanation, as opposed to here are facts, 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 memorize these facts, now you're armed and dangerous kind of explanation. So we think that for 3 reasons. Those effects were, as in the title, the durability of this intervention with AI that debunked the conspiracy theories. It endured. That's a hallmark of GIST memories, not verbatim memories. Those fade rapidly. It also showed far transfer to conspiracy theories that were superficially different than the ones that were instructed. That's a hallmark of GIST, not verbatim memory. And also we did an independent classification of 355 of the conversations that are a representative sample that were available online. We used AI, not humans who might be biased, to classify these into mainly GIST or mainly verbatim arguments, and they said that the active ingredient in that intervention was 97% of them were classified as GIST. Only 3% were verbatim. So yes, facts, scientific facts are important, But the notion here is that explaining the facts so that you get the gist, so that science makes sense, is the key thing to debunking these conspiracy theories. All right, so in conclusion, low knowledge makes you vulnerable, if not just because you don't have a storehouse of point-to-point refutations of any incoming misinformation, but because the world does not make sense, and the misinformation fills that vacuum with things that do make sense, especially on a gist level as opposed to a verbatim level, as the wonderful work by Helgesen, Langdon, and Efron showed. Gist spreads more rapidly on social media. Gist is taken seriously, and people overlook even when they know things are false. So in that earlier study, they told people that the Kamala Harris statement was false. They knew it was false, but they could explain it. It was consistent with the gist, so it was still true. All right, so AI trust throws gasoline on the fire in a complex and fast-moving information environment. If you just blindly trust in AI, you're even more susceptible. The data showed that. The data showed that the AI debunking seemed to be conveying the gist. 97% of the arguments were mainly gist. And political bias, system 2, including numeracy and cognitive reflection, were not sufficient. And our current environment is a perfect storm for misinformation. Thank you very much. We can take questions? Yes, Gort.
Somebody cruelly put this mic too high. Hi, Val. So I'm trying to get some understanding of what gist plausibility is. Like I get the idea of when someone says something that is factually false, but the underlying meaning is true, people will say that the gist is there and it's still okay. But when people are making the ratings of plausibility for those items, how do you, because you haven't really extracted those two things in those questions. It's another version of like, if you just asked how much do you believe this, would you get basically the same results? Or another version of the question is, what is a non-gist plausibility rating?
Well, plausibility, it depends on how you define plausibility. If you say, I have an associationistic model, and I have this list of facts, and when they're true, I'm going to say it's plausible. When they're false, I'm going to say it's not. That's not what we mean by gist plausibility. We mean it makes sense to me. You know, so in many of the things, and that's one reason why we put conspiracy theories, those were true or false. When you control for your belief, including we had one identical item that spanned this conspiracy, you agree or disagree, true, false, versus you think it's far-fetched or makes sense. So many people said that that item was, in fact, false, but it made sense to them. It made a little sense to them. It's kind of an inroad. So that's a way to pull those two apart.
Okay, so I guess one version of the question is, there are cases in which something makes sense, but it's not false or true. And maybe they're agnostic about it.
And that's where your worldview and your knowledge comes in. You know, there's the world makes sense or it doesn't. This domain makes sense or it doesn't. Chemotherapy or say vaccination, perfect example. It makes sense because it's natural, it uses your body, or it's completely unnatural technology where people are sticking this device in your body. Which of those is your worldview? I happen to believe in the vaccination takes advantage of the natural body's responses, but that's a worldview. It's neither true nor false. It's a nature of my understanding with which I approach incoming facts. Am I good? Yeah, I'm done.
All right, hello everyone. It's great to be here on the big stage. It's a real honor to share it with some awesome scholars, so thanks all of you for attending. My name's Alex Burgoyne, and today I'm going to be giving a talk titled Growth Mindset, Separating Myth from Reality. So let's get into it. I'm guessing many of you in this room have heard of growth mindset before. It's a pretty popular construct within the educational psychology literature. Due in part to a popular press book written by Carol Dweck, Mindset, the New Psychology of Success. Following that up, she gave a TED Talk, which is one of the most viewed TED Talks of all time. And since then, there's been a whole industry that has formed around this construct. selling growth mindset products, whether they're self-help books or curriculum supplements or interventions to schools. In fact, there's even a mindset scholars network devoted to studying growth mindset. So what is mindset? Why has it been so influential? Well, a growth mindset simply reflects the belief that abilities or attributes are malleable. And by contrast, a fixed mindset reflects the belief that attributes are generally stable. And typically, mindset is measured using questionnaire items, like the one on the bottom of the screen there. You can learn new things, but you can't really change your intelligence. Do you agree or disagree? So this is how mindset is measured. If you agree with a statement like this, you would be coded as having a fixed mindset. From a cognitive psychology standpoint, we can see that they're tacitly referencing crystallized intelligence versus fluid intelligence. Lay people might not understand that, but it turns out how they interpret the word intelligence affects how they respond to questionnaire items like this. Now, my interest in mindset started when I was just a graduate student. I had read Carol Dweck's book, and I had started noticing that there were some pretty bold claims made about this concept. Just a few are listed here. Your mindset profoundly affects the way you lead your life. People's mindsets create entire psychological worlds as though they're the lens through which we process incoming information. There's a powerful impact of growth mindset messages upon students' attainment. This is getting at the idea of growth mindset interventions, which might nudge students towards adopting a growth mindset, in turn potentially benefiting their performance. And finally, my favorite bold claim of all is actually the title of an American Psychologist article. I'll just read it. Mindsets and Human Nature, Promoting Change in the Middle East, the Schoolyard, the Racial Divide, and Willpower. It's quite the list. So I have a confession to make. When I got into this research world, I kind of believed in growth mindset, a little bit. I'm a musician. I practice hours every single day, and you almost have to have a growth mindset to do what I do. So a lot of these ideas resonated with me. It made sense. And so I wanted to study, is this real? Do these claims actually have merit? And so this was my very first project as a graduate student. I wanted to study mindset in a context I was familiar with. So this is my first year project. I was a graduate student interested in piano skill acquisition. And so I recruited 161 novices, and I gave them 18 minutes of practice in our dingy piano practice room within the expertise lab at Michigan State. I made this animated video lesson for them to practice along to, so it was a standardized sort of set of materials. And their goal was to learn to play the song Happy Birthday from memory after all that practice. I recorded their performances as MIDI data, so I could programmatically analyze how many notes they played correctly. But I also made 3 graduate students that were studying piano performance. I made them suffer and listen to all of the happy birthdays and evaluate them. It was a lot. So here are the skill acquisition trajectories for my 161 participants. Each line is a different participant, and practically every line is unique. Obviously, there's a lot of variability here. Some people start at different points than others. Some people's learning curves are much steeper than others. Some people, after all that practice, they still haven't mastered it. Maybe they haven't even gotten close. Now, this is not just one performance attempt. They had several performance attempts, both with a metronome and without a metronome, and this is the average of their performance over time. So what explains all of this variability? Well, I measured several cognitive abilities, working memory and fluid intelligence. I measured auditory discrimination skill, or music aptitude, whether people could hear the difference between pitches and tell whether rhythms were the same or different. And of course, I administered the growth mindset questionnaire. So here are the results predicting skill acquisition. This is a structural equation model where the circles represent latent factors and the rectangles represent observed measures. And you can see that growth mindset did not predict skill acquisition. That's a non-significant path. It actually trended in the wrong direction, such that fixed mindset participants maybe were trending towards performing slightly better, but again, not significantly different from 0. There's one other finding in this paper which I think is interesting, and that's the relationship between cognitive ability and music aptitude or auditory discrimination ability. My colleague Jason Sukahara has followed up on this result. You guys should check out this paper in study 2. He has these new measures of attention control, and he really elaborates on this link, so I encourage you to check that out. But this was the first null result, perhaps of many. And as a graduate student, I had this self-blame ideology. I was like, what did I do wrong in this experiment? Was it not challenging enough? Why didn't growth mindset have an influence on these participants? So I went back to the theory and I started looking a little more closely, and I realized that at least in the older version of the work, like the 1986 paper, mindset has a couple links in the chain before you get to behavior. And often when you're reading about these associations between growth mindset and goal orientation and then behavior following a challenging experience, you read about these relations as though they're perfect relations. But is that really true? Because if they are not perfect relations, that's going to dilute the effect of mindset. So, with my colleagues, Zach Hambrick, who is my graduate advisor, and Brooke McNamara, who is my amazing colleague in this research world, I want to give a shout out to Brooke because she's just been wonderful to work with on this growth mindset project. So we set out to test some of the major core central premises of mindset theory. Here are the 6 that we tested in this paper. The first was that people with a growth mindset hold learning goals. They want to learn new things. Next, that people with fixed mindsets hold performance goals, and in particular, performance avoidance goals. So, if you have a fixed mindset, you either want to demonstrate your ability, or you really do not want to demonstrate a lack of ability. That's performance avoidance. Point number 4, it's been claimed that people with fixed mindsets believe that talent alone creates success. We tested that. Point 5, that people with growth mindsets persist to overcome challenges. And point 6 is my absolute favorite, the claim that people with growth mindsets are more resilient following failure. This is a critical claim, and the way that we tested claim number 6 was by giving our participants a failure scenario. Specifically, we gave them Raven's advanced progressive matrices, but we gave them the 4 hardest problems first, and we did not give them enough time. So, as everyone failed, the timer ran out, we put in this bright red text on the screen like, you have earned 0 out of 4, answered 0 out of 4 correctly, that's 0%, please proceed to the rest of the test. So this was this failure experience. We thought growth mindset would be protective. And then we got the results. And there are the 6 core premises listed in order. And most of the relations were either not significant. In fact, the strongest relationship we found was in the wrong direction. So after that failure experience on Raven's matrices, it was folks with a more fixed mindset that tended to perform better on the test. And the theory predicts that, at least for some people with a fixed mindset, they ought not to be performing so well following that. So the theoretical claims don't hold up. What else might not hold up? This was a major undertaking that Brooke and I worked on. This is a collection of meta-analyses that was recently published in Psych Bulletin, and this is some of the work that I'm most proud of. We wanted to know whether growth mindset interventions, which are directed at students, actually improve academic achievement. As I said, there's a whole for-profit industry marketing this sort of curriculum supplement. So does it really work? As we were doing our literature search, we realized we were in a little over our heads. The number of studies that were entering the literature was just increasing rapidly. This histogram ends in 2018, but the trend continues. So if you just search growth mindset on PubMed, you can see it continues to proliferate. But looking at these intervention studies, we wanted to know, do they actually benefit academic achievement? So here you can see a forest plot of all the effects. We had 96 different effects. Our sample size was a little under 100,000 students in this meta-analysis. And you can see the average effect of these interventions on achievement was a Cohen's d of 0.05. So that's 1/20th of a standard deviation, which is not nothing. It's maybe not a profound effect. It was statistically significant. It's not nothing. But the story doesn't end there. So we conducted tests for publication bias. None of these are ideal for random effects meta-analysis, but we did find evidence for publication bias, and when you account for that, you see the effect comes closer to zero and is no longer statistically significant. But the story doesn't end there either, because as we were looking through the literature, we realized many of these interventions are missing critical ingredients, like a control group. So Brooke and I, we pre-registered 10 best practices that these sorts of interventions ought to follow. And when we coded how many of the best practices did these studies actually follow, you can see the histogram right there. Some of the most egregious omissions were the lack of a control group, no manipulation check. So they're trying to instill a growth mindset, but they don't actually test whether they moved students towards more of a growth mindset. No random assignment, teachers not blind to condition, so they know which of their students were in the growth mindset intervention group and which were in the control group. Not ideal. And when you look at study quality as a moderator, the way we actually set this up was in 3 separate analyses, but you can see that as the quality of the studies improves, the effect size decreases and ultimately is not significantly different from 0. So in this bar chart, if you look at the bar on the far left, that's the first model with all of those effect sizes in there. The bar in the middle represents studies that actually had an influence on students' mindsets. This is the mechanism of action. So this meta-analysis 2, that middle bar, if mindset is driving these effects, these are the studies that had that effect. They ought to show an effect on academic achievement. You can see the effect size is smaller. When we go to meta-analysis 3, which is the black bar, these are the studies that followed the most of our best practices, and you can see the effect is even closer to 0 and not significant. So among the higher quality studies, there's no effect. I thought that was the end of it, but the story gets worse. So we also coded whether researchers might have a potential financial conflict of interest. And this was an absolutely shocking finding to us. We found that those researchers were more than twice as likely to publish positive effects. So if you look in the published literature on the right side there, researchers with financial incentives, maybe they're selling growth mindset products, they tend to find significant and positive effects in the published literature. If you look at that white bar, these are researchers without financial incentives. They find effects that are not significant and are trending negative. What a stark contrast. This was one of the only moderators that was significant, was whether the researchers had skin in the game, if you will. So I thought that was going to be the end of it. I kind of figured, like, that's got to be the last nail in the coffin. Like, this evidence is damning, if I may. How can this theory survive? Well, it can. It's like a hydra. Like, you cut off one head and there's like several more. Sorry. And one of the ways that it's sort of evolved or morphed, if you will, is through flexibility in the mechanism of action. So I shared earlier the 1986 version of the theory. The theory has evolved. It's taken many forms. Sometimes it's taken different forms in the same year by the same set of authors on 2 different papers. The process models change. Sometimes there's moderators like school context. Sometimes there are not these moderators. So these are researcher degrees of freedom. It's a slippery theory to test when it can morph like this. It gives you a lot of outs for those null results. The other problem is who benefits. There's been a bit of a fishing expedition looking for subgroup effects. My favorite example, I was a reviewer on a paper where they used a machine learning approach, which was very cool, to find which subgroups of participants benefited from mindset interventions. This is a purely data-driven approach. And sure, you can post hoc a rationalization for why it makes sense that in this slice of the data you find an effect. That doesn't mean it's going to replicate. So this is a problem. Who benefits? You can slice your sample a million different ways, right? You're bound to find an effect in some small subgroup. That's not good theory. That's not great science either. So in the few minutes I have left, what explains this appeal? Why has mindset taken hold to such an extent? Well, I actually think one of our colleagues, Dawn Oyserman, said it best when she said, some ideas just feel right. They are culturally fluent. And I think growth mindset was right on target for the cultural milieu of the time, promoting ideals that we want to believe in and that we want to believe are true. And in this way, it almost paves the path for an easier review process to go with the grain of these cultural ideals. So what are some of the fallacies that mindset takes advantage of? Oversimplification, we're talking about complex outcomes, but we're reducing them essentially to a single variable. Empowerment, this bootstraps fallacy, the idea that if you really, put your mind to it, you can achieve anything. So it instills us with this internal locus of control, this belief in ourselves. It's egalitarian in that the theory doesn't acknowledge many of the individual difference factors that we know matter. It also doesn't acknowledge many of the systemic factors. There are barriers for some, there are not barriers for all, but growth mindset theory doesn't spend a lot of time talking about that. Within this theoretical framework, almost anyone can achieve almost anything with the right mindset. But there are downsides to that, particularly when you fail. What explanations does this theory offer when you fail to accomplish your goal? It can lead to self-blame. Your failures are very personal. Within the realm of this theory, if you failed, it's because you must not have believed in yourself, that you could improve. You must not have persisted enough when challenged, or you must not have sought adequate learning opportunities to get to that next level. It doesn't leave you many outs for ego preservation, if you will. If you failed to achieve, it was something on you that you failed to do. And similarly, if others fail to achieve their goals, we can sort of take the same lens and point it towards them. Well, they failed because they didn't believe in themselves. They didn't persist enough. That's not necessarily great. So this is my final slide, so I'm right on time. Just for all of us here, what were some of the red flags? What are some of the things we should be looking for as new theories enter the literature? One of the major red flags was these bold claims about mindsets effects, profound effects creating entire psychological worlds. Sounds too good to be true. It straddled the line between science and pop press, and many of the researchers who are writing these peer-reviewed articles are also partaking in the industry, marketing this construct and products associated with it. So this leads to the financial incentives. The presence of financial incentives, whether consciously or not, could influence the results we report or how we report them. But then I think the final red flag is probably the most important, that we see this concept applied across domains that seem to have little in common. Applied to academic achievement, as well as weight loss, as well as willpower, bridging the racial divide, peace in the Middle East. Where does it end? Maybe it will be applied to rheumatism, neuralgia, lumbago. Who knows where growth mindset will go next? But hopefully, with this information in mind, we're braced, we're ready, and we'll be a skeptical audience when the next theory of this sort comes around, and we can be quick to be skeptical and to question it. All right, I'm out of time. Thank you so much.
We're going to hold off on questions till the end. Otherwise, we kind of run out of time. So if you can hold your questions to the end, we'll have 10 minutes at the end. You could ask. Thank you. Before my slides come up, my name is Dan Robinson. I'm an educational psychology guy, so you might be wondering, what's he doing in the session? Why is he at Psychonomics Society? No, I'm not lost. There's a reason why I'm here. I'm going to talk a little bit about educational psychology, information, misinformation. Hopefully it'll be somewhat relevant to what you consider your field. I'm also from Texas. I reside in Texas, so very appropriate that we're talking about misinformation. In Texas, we're doing our part to move measles and now whooping cough to the off the endangered list. So, all right, I guess I can advance this. So, what have I been up to the last 20 years? Most faculty are supposed to be, conducting empirical research and contributing in some way. And I look over these 4 studies that I've been part of, and what's worse, I've involved colleagues and even worse, graduate students in. And I've been looking at the field and trying to figure out what's going on with our field. And I encourage you to do the same, whatever you would consider your field to be. But I look at these and I'll go over kind of what we've done over the last 20 years. But I think the main purpose of these is to make my colleagues feel bad around the country, feel bad about what they're doing. And so let me get to what we found, what we've been up to. So in these studies that we've been doing the last 20 years, we've mainly looked at 5 empirical journals in the field of educational psychology, and however you define that. And we've been looking at whether the methodology they use would be considered intervention, experimental, or other. And other we usually call observational. That could include all qualitative studies, and it includes what we would also call correlational studies, where we collect data in one point in time, and we just simply look at correlations. And I've noticed that a lot of research has been done, especially over the last 20 years, especially in education. They look at large data sets, and they will look at student responses to some questionnaires, like Alex was talking about, and they'll look at student outcome variables like test scores, things like that. And then some way along the way, they will apply structural equation modeling, hierarchical linear modeling, whatever, path analysis. And with this magical modeling tool, you can take correlational data and causality emerges. And then you can make recommendations for practice. And so I've already given away my talk. I might as well just give up right now. So anyway, we're looking at these articles. We decided just to go back to 1983, over 40 years ago. And we found that in all those journals of the empirical articles, almost half were random assignment experiments where individuals were randomly assigned to conditions and an independent variable was manipulated. In correlational studies, by the way, independent variables are not manipulated. This is ex post facto research. Looking at 1994, when we actually looked across all the journals and looked at whether they were intervention, experimental. By the way, intervention would also include like single case design, quasi-experimental. We were even conservative and threw in like regression, discontinuity designs, interrupted time series designs, anything that had strong causal power there. And we found that, almost half back in 1994, 30 years ago, in these journals were intervention studies where the researchers manipulated an independent variable and studied the effects on some dependent variable. Experimental was down to 37%. By 2000, intervention had gone down to 40. Experimental had also dipped down. 2004 continues to dip down a little bit. See, experimental now is down to 23%. 2010 continues to dip down, and then we just did one 5 years ago and published it. Intervention research now is about a fourth of all empirical studies in educational psychology journals, and experimental research is about 1/5. So look at that, going from about half 40 years ago down to 1/5. Why is that? Maybe somebody in the audience will have answers today, but I have a couple of theories about why that may be. So this is like phase 1 of our study. That was the one published back in 2005. There's been a decline in experimental research. Who cares? Big deal, right? We have such better methods now than doing those stupid experiments. So then we decided, like, all right, well, that might not be so bad, right? Because if you're doing non-intervention research, maybe you're just doing correlational studies as a step to identify possible relationships so that you could later then decide what would be some variables we might want to manipulate if we wanted to, say, improve student achievement, for example, right? So in 1994, the percent of those non-intervention articles that contained what we call prescriptive statements, which are basically recommendations for practice. These might appear in the abstract. These are more likely to appear in the discussion. And then some of our journals, especially Journal of Educational Psychology, Contemporary Ed Psych now, they require authors to include a section on educational implications, right? Well, that's almost a license to be stupid, right? Especially if you have methodology that doesn't really warrant itself for you to be making recommendations for practice. So 30% back in 94, that had gone up to 43% in 2004, up to 46 in 2010. And then when we looked at 2020, we found something very interesting, because between 2010 and 2020, in case you hadn't been reading the literature, the use of causal modeling techniques, and they actually call them that, causal modeling techniques, exploded. Everybody's doing it now. And very few are manipulating independent variables. We found that about 2/3 of those non-intervention articles were making recommendations for practice. Is that okay? Are they accurate? Or do we end up with stuff like learning styles and growth mindset? Does that emerge from those types of things? One of my favorite quotes from Donald Ruman, design always trumps analysis. Doesn't matter what kind of fancy analysis you use. Your design is what's most important. And we aren't using designs that really allow for strong inference for causality. So is educational psychology research becoming less scientific? We use this in the title of one of our, the 2023 paper that we published. And actually, Fred Paz, who is editor of EdPsych Review, said, Dan, could you spice up the title a little bit, make it more interesting? You know, kind of like some editors say, why don't you make some recommendations for practice in your crappy paper that aren't really warranted? And people do that. So I said, sure, I'll take that bait. I'll make something very controversial. There's nothing like getting a response out of my colleagues than saying, is educational psychology research becoming less scientific? I think that paper we just published in 2023 has like over 30 citations now. So at least, lit some fires in some people. Here's what we wrote. Educational psychology is continuing its movement toward the dark side of the quality continuum. Kind of a Star Wars reference. There are fewer intervention studies and more armchair research, analyzing large data sets from the comfort of offices. More alarming is the increase in the tendency for authors to infer causality from correlation and offer recommendations based on shaky ground. The statistical models that flood our journals are causal, not causal. They are connected only through a vowel movement that is stinking up our field. Now, it's always cool when you can sneak in words like that, right, and people let you publish them, but that's probably what kind of shook some people up and made them respond to our talk. So if you want that paper, I wrote that with Howard Weiner a few years ago. Okay, so what's the latest stage of this? So we go through and we look at, decline in experiments, increase in non-intervention research, and then there's this increase in statistical modeling that some people think is magical, and we're cranking out more and more recommendations for practice based on correlational type research. Well, here's an example. This one showed up in Science Daily, which is a British publication. They studied 600 UK teenagers. This suggests that having a stronger self-awareness and sense of purpose may raise their standardized test score math scores by a couple of grades. Couple of grades by, increasing their self-awareness. Great. In that study, they analyzed student questionnaire data, which is my favorite, data collected at one time point using structural equation modeling. I'm not trying to knock SEM. I think that's a fantastic method if you have a hierarchical design with interventions. Raising self-awareness and sense of purpose is not likely to raise math performance. It's just as likely to increase math performance raises self-awareness. This is the same stuff we learned back in the 70s with the self-esteem movement, right? And it's the same thing we're learning now with growth mindset and other things. How are we falling into the same trap? How are we getting even dumber? The watering down of educational psychology research. So we have less intervention studies, more correlation, more recommendations based on correlation, and perhaps less credibility. And again, if you're not in educational psychology today, you're thinking, well, this doesn't apply to my field. Maybe it doesn't apply to your field. But I would ask you, think about what your field is, and is any of this stuff going on there? How are zombie concepts still alive, especially like learning styles? So I got the idea for this latest study from a nice review in EdPsych Review published by John Hattie. And they reviewed learning styles research, right? Keep putting nails into the skull of that zombie, perhaps eventually he dies. But I think it's more like the Hydra, like you mentioned. The more we drive in nails, the more heads he grows. So for learning styles research, citations actually increased from 60 to 2002. And then we started, doing things like the Pashler et al. Review, where they looked at learning styles research and they said, oh my God, this is crap. And, they think like, all right, please stop the learning style stuff. Don't do any more research on it. And especially keep that stuff out of our schools. Stop sending our kids home with, learning styles inventories. They dipped for 10 years, and now, today, in 2025, citations exceed the 2002 rate. They're at an all-time high. This thing keeps growing. So Hattie and O'Leary distinguished studies that tested the matching hypothesis, where they see like, well, if your kid tested for having like an auditory learning style, your kid then should do best if taught using an auditory mode of instruction as opposed to a tactile mode or something like that. And they also had correlational studies. A lot of learning styles research uses correlational studies. Not just a lot, almost all. The latter don't answer whether we should match instruction to learning style. Causality and directionality are lost. That was Hattie and O'Leary's words. And that's their paper, just published in EdPsych Review. Another good one. Will it have any effect on shutting down learning styles research and practice? Probably not. So I decided to look at examples of educational practices out there that would fall into two categories. The first is the overhyped and undersupported, right? What we've just been talking about with growth mindset and so on. So I decided to add in grit. And while I was doing my research on what's out there with grit, I found that Alex has now decided to tackle grit too. That's in his on his radar right now. I don't know if you know much about grit, but this was like growth mindset, very popular. Oh my God, in the K-12 schools, they were having like grit parades and crap like that. And you know, grit is basically like, you know, your persistence. You know, we want kids with grit. That's because, you know, when they experience some failure, very similar to growth mindset, they experience struggles, failures, things like that, they have this thing called grit, and that gets them through, and that's going to take them through life, and grit will, you know, predict everything. And then we looked at learning styles, obviously. That's another overhyped, undersupported. And then we looked at, you know, coincidentally, growth mindset theory, and we have the McNamara and Burgoyne article up here. Oh, and I decided to throw in this, my favorite slide. I use this in every talk now. It's from The Onion, but it shows the extent of learning styles and its impact. And I love the caption under the poor girl there, a nasal learner struggles with an odorless textbook. So if you think, you know, what we do in K-12 education is not stupid, just look at this one. All right, then we have the underhyped, oversupported category. And in there I put things, you know, that may be familiar to you, like retrieval practice, right? Not so much hyped in K-12 education, but over-supported. My God, there's a lot of support for the intervention of retrieval practice as a study technique. And then we looked at the spacing effect, or distributed practice, which also has a lot of support. And I think these two are pretty relevant for a Psychonomics Society meeting. And then I decided to look at cognitive load theory. If you're not familiar with that, that's John Sweller's group. And they look at things like, you know, different types of cognitive load. And their most famous intervention is like the worked example effect, where if you're teaching people math, if you show them worked examples as an intermediate step, it can, you know, be pretty effective as an intervention. So let's look at these different categories. So I searched the ERIC database, which I could have searched PsycInfo, probably would have been more relevant here, but these are educational concepts. And I wanted to see what was out there in just the educational research database. And I looked just for titles in 2024 because I'm old and lazy now. I don't want to look through 20 years of data anymore. But I thought maybe this would be a representative year, all of 2024. So we looked at the topic of grit and found that there were 64 overall articles in 2024. 62 of them were observational in terms of methodology. One intervention study, I don't even think it really tested grit, but they just had an intervention in there. And then one non-empirical. Growth mindset had 50 articles, 42 were observational, 4 intervention, and 4 non-empirical. And then learning styles, 28, 2 and 2. You add those up, 90% of those overhyped, undersupported use observational techniques, 5% intervention studies. If they had more intervention studies, what would they find if they actually tested what they were doing? And then for the underhyped, oversupported retrieval practice, yeah, this is educational research. They don't like stuff that actually works, I guess. So 6 observational, 12 intervention. Distributed practice, this one was funny. Distributed practice with the spacing effect. 0, 0, and 2, non-empirical. I guess we don't need the spacing effect studied anymore. And then cognitive load, 24, 42, and 7. And then look at the percentages. Only 31% observational, over half were intervention. So I don't know if there's a causal implication here, but if you have something in education that you're proud of and you think, hey, we should be recommending this for practice, let's put this out in the schools and so on, perhaps you should design an intervention study to see whether it works. Perhaps we need something better than, like the NAEP data set and then a whole bunch of questionnaire data and see if you can do some fancy modeling and see what you can crank out. So quackery in education. There's a sucker born every minute, right? And then I want to leave you with a quote that Hattie and O'Leary left in their article. The learning styles claims are still used to defend policy. A presentation of the Tennessee Senate defended the Science of Reading bill. Now, stop right there, the Science of Reading bill. My God, we finally got them to stop teaching whole language, reading recovery. You ever hear that podcast, Sold the Story? It was about the whole reading recovery stuff, and we know as cognitive psychologists that phonics instruction is kind of important too, to teach reading. So you got this Science of Reading bill. Great, right? We're finally kind of moving in the right direction. So they defend the Science of Reading bill because literacy instruction should integrate auditory, visual, and kinesthetic activities because that is how the brain works. Ouch. All right, I'm done. Thank you. And we're going to leave questions to the end.
I'll be your best friend if you put it in presentation mode. No, they're not doing it. Okay. No speaker notes, please. Oh, maybe they're going to do it now. Okay. While that's happening, I'll introduce myself. My name's Ben Motes. I'm from the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Indiana University. I'm so honored to be a part of this symposium. I have to give credit to these amazing speakers. So far, the presentations have done an amazing job giving what I'll call an outward perspective on how, the products of research in other fields might present claims that are in effect dubious, that have dubious relevance to educational practice. What I'm going to do in my talk is I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to present an inward-facing provocation, basically, asking whether the claims that we have in cognitive psychology, whether those actually do have the right kinds of juice for informing educational practice, or instead if they're similarly dubious. Yes, it worked. Okay, and I'm going to hang out on this title slide for a moment and introduce my talk, and I'll carry this through with the streetlight effect. Many of you have probably heard of the streetlight effect before. If you haven't, it can be illustrated with a simple sketch. I want you to imagine that maybe in a park and in the nighttime, in the dark, there's a street lamp with a kind of illuminated spot underneath it, and there's a person on the ground who's looking for something. And a police officer approaches this person and says, "I'm sorry, are you okay?" And the person says, "Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, I lost my keys." And the police officer says, "Oh, I'm sorry that you lost your keys. I can help. Can you tell me where you last saw them?" And the person who's on the ground says, "Oh, I lost them over there, but the lighting's just better over here." But And so I want to ask us, again, in a provocation, whether maybe as cognitive psychologists who are studying how people learn, we might be studying learning where the lighting is good. In controlled labs where we might be able to isolate the mechanisms and measure super precisely the learning outcomes that we want to be able to test, and also we can replicate cleanly. We can say this is precisely the way that you should set up the learning paradigm so that you could get the same exact effect later on. And then we make recommendations. We say this works, this improves memory encoding, meaning, in all seriousness, that it worked underneath the streetlight. But as the previous talks have shown, through growth mindsets being wildly overstated, through learning styles persisting, in the spite of absolute, total absence of any evidence that it works, I want to ask whether we're looking under the wrong light, whether the things that we're doing in respect to our cognitive psychology research on student learning is actually like maybe isolating in a space that doesn't have practical applicability to educational practice. So how does it work? We might observe in the lab that something, and you can fill in any X here, but I'm going to talk about pre-questions today. So I'll say like pre-question. Pre-questions improves learning in my lab. And from that laboratory research, it's common for people to make theoretical claims, like, for example, that X enhances memory. And one could infer then that maybe I could take this practice, this thing that seems to encode memory, and take it into an educational context. And then maybe if you've got, I don't know, a class that you teach or you're friends with somebody else who's teaching, you design an embedded experiment, which would be rare but awesome. You observe then perhaps that X improves learning in my class or in that class. And then the practical recommendation becomes something like, now teachers should use X. Teachers should use pre-questions. This is a fundamentally different claim than the claim that came out of the laboratory study, which is just that maybe X could have some mechanisms that's associated with improving encoding. Now we're saying other people should do this thing, and other people might observe the same benefit. I want to be clear, I don't think this is malicious information, malicious misinformation. We're doing careful science. But there's obviously a gap between we observed this effect and this effect will work universally. And the problem isn't that our theories are wrong. It's not that we're doing science incorrectly. It's that we're not really specifying the conditions that these effects depend on. We don't articulate the boundary conditions. This pattern has been super well documented, so it's not just like new that you're finding out from me. So Yarkoni called it the generalizability crisis, that we make these sweeping verbal generalizations that lack meaningful connection to our actual statistical findings, which are in the narrow context of where we did the experiment. Simons and colleagues call for constraints on generality, that these would be statements that we would include in our manuscripts instead of like statements about educational practice. We're instead going to say these are the boundaries wherein we might expect this effect. Brian Tipton and Yeager advocate for a heterogeneity revolution, where we'd, instead of trying to find main effects, instead we would change our science so that we're systematically analyzing where and for whom and why an effect might exist. So we've known that this has been a problem for years. I'm not the first to mention it. So I want to emphasize, however, why I think it's particularly important to discuss. So nowadays, we have megaphones. So we have preprints and open access and social media and science communication. And I want to make totally clear that I think that the fact that scientists have megaphones is a good thing. But they also mean that our claims have the potential to reach further and faster than ever before. So when we say pre-questions work based on our lab studies or based on some narrow tests in particular classes, we could be amplified by the fact that maybe some tweet gets, I don't know, retweeted enough times, or an influencer posts it on a teacher-facing newsletter. Weston Bergstrom showed that scientists, and I think actually the past presenters showed, that scientists face incentives to kind of overhype their findings. And this creates misinformation when the science itself is sound. Recent work on something called overgeneralized health messaging, have you heard of OHM? Shows that information can be factually correct, but still misleading and harmful when applied too broadly. So Kenkova and colleagues found that OHM produces outcomes when it's on social media that are just as detrimental as misinformation, even though it's grounded in science, nevertheless, because people are taking it out of context, imagining that it might work in new contexts, and those contexts turn out to be false. And here's the crucial part. So when we make universal claims, replacing those precious few practitioners who might actually listen to us, we're placing them at risk. This erodes epistemic trust. Even if the people don't believe the hype, they might see that we're trying to oversell for no particular scientific reason. So when teachers try pre-questions based on our recommendations and it doesn't work, or worse, it backfires for struggling students, then it doesn't just hurt those students. I mean, it's bad that it hurts those students, but it also erodes public trust in psychological science. So we can't afford to make claims about educational practice that don't hold up in practice, which brings me to why I think details matter. So teachers need actionable guidance. On the one hand, it's not the case that we should just talk about context because it's an important thing to clarify. It's also got value to teachers who actually care. Knowing that spacing works doesn't necessarily inform a 9th grade algebra instructor on how to do anything differently. So if we want to have practical impact, it's important to specify the scope of what our streetlight is illuminating. And that's a good thing. It makes for more informative and actionable guidance. In other words, teachers do care. I don't think, we can't see like who all is attending Psychonomics. We can only see the speakers. Is Pooja Agarwal here? No, I don't see. Okay. Pooja had this amazing paper in 2024 where Pooja reflected on a number of years running retrievalpractice.org. Retrievalpractice.org is a website and an associated newsletter that basically did outreach, science outreach about research on retrieval practice. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about Pooja's paper was that she reflected on like what got the most traction, what got the most clicks in the newsletter, and what got the most clicks in the website. And one of the things that got the most clicks was not a scientific article showing that pre-questions work. It wasn't I don't know, detailed expansion on exactly how to implement it. Instead, it was a brief section of a newsletter and an article associated with it on test anxiety, which showed that teachers weren't just thinking about finding out what works, they were thinking about mechanisms and what the implications of an implementation of that testing effect might be in their classrooms. It might cause students to be more concerned, might cause them to have demotivation, and these are things that teachers care about. Okay, and here's the crucial part. On the other side of the coin, these aren't just implementation details, they're big consequences for student outcomes. They can even moderate the effect itself. So spacing isn't all good. Spacing can totally reduce perceived fluency. It can lead to demotivation. Retrieval practice depends on effort. So you can't just give like practice quizzes at the end of the week that have no grade associated with and students don't really care about and expect that to do anything for your students. Okay, and also pre-questions can backfire when overly challenging. So that brings us to pre-questions. I'm going to spend the rest of my talk giving kind of an overview of a large-scale many classes study that I think exemplifies how we could do things differently. And the study focused on pre-questions. So what are pre-questions? Pre-questions are questions that you present to a learner just prior to them receiving instructions. And in that regard, they're a little bit weird because a learner who's presented a pre-question doesn't yet know the answer. And yet, about 100 years of laboratory research has found that when you present pre-questions prior to instruction, the pre-questions improve what learners learn from the subsequent instruction, compared with no pre-questions or compared sometimes with alternative controls. So this is our streetlight. 100 years, a century of careful, controlled studies showing that pre-questions work. And the effect sizes are impressive, the findings replicate, mechanisms are debated, but the benefits seem to be practically clear. So we should confidently recommend teachers use pre-questions. But wait, this is a streetlight. And what happens when we step outside the streetlight? Many classes is our solution to our streetlight problem. So many classes, as you might guess, is a research model where instead of testing a practical practice in one context or in one classroom, we test it in many classes. And in the second many classes study, we implemented pre-questions in 30 different classes. This was a wildly diverse sample. We had 6th grade Spanish all the way through college senior level business statistics. In these classes, we had we administered informed consent. There was about 3,000 students overall enrolled, but 50% or so agreed to be part of the study. And when they agreed, we did a within-subject comparison. Each student watched 2 videos, and one was preceded by pre-questions, one did not have pre-questions before it. Obviously, the order of those was counterbalanced. Students, because they generally have control of their learning, had control of whether they answered the pre-questions. I guess they had to like click something to be able to get to the video, but then they had the ability to control how much of the video they watched, and we measured that. All these things were created by the teachers. We didn't say like, hey, here's the way that we want you to implement pre-questions on these materials. We instead said, teachers, make materials that could have pre-questions and make pre-questions. So teachers had a wide amount of latitude to make it so that it was naturalistic to how normative practice would happen. And so, yeah, we measured learning on delayed classroom assessments and video analytics, like how much of the videos students watched. And again, this is learning in the wild. This isn't under a single streetlight. This is under 30 different streetlights. If you want to get to the many classes paper, there's a QR code. I want to give so much credit to people who've been involved in this. A many classes study is not a study that you just kind of like do on your own. It requires massive collaboration. So I'm not going to have time to name all the names of the people who are on the paper, but I want to call out Anna Keeney, who is a study coordinator who made it all happen. So like actually had meetings with individual teachers to make sure that they were understanding what the process was. And also Josh DeLay, who's somewhere here. Josh DeLay was also a many classes co-lead, has kept us in line with all of our statistics. So, okay, what was our finding? There was a global finding. So pre-questions work. The average effect across all these different classes was roughly 5% increase in student performance on the pre-questions when those pre-questions were included on delayed assessments, whether it was a quiz or a midterm or whatever the next unit test was. The odds ratio was less than what we observed in the lab, but that's normal. So we expect that there would be more noise. We expect that there would be more influences on students, and that might reduce any intervention effect. But there was an overall improvement on the pre-tested material. All classes showed directional improvement, and there was no difference in institutions or grade levels or subjects. So great news. The findings hold up in practice, and we could stop here. We could buy a billboard, and we could say, let's all recommend pre-questions to teachers. But let's look closer at what we also found. Quite surprising to all of us, we measured video analytics. We expected that when people were presented with pre-questions and then they watched a video, that the pre-questions would increase the amount of time that students spend watching the videos. But we instead found that students watched less of the videos after pre-questions, that when we administered pre-questions, it actually reduced, on average, the amount of the videos that students watched. And when we dug deeper, we found this other remarkable thing, that effect isn't necessarily like everybody watching a little bit less. It's driven primarily by a subset of the group. So 21.6%, when they got pre-questions, didn't even start the video, compared with 16.5% of students who didn't even start the video in the control condition. So these students seem to be caused by pre-questions to disengage. So there's really no evidence. So if we take those students out, we also then looked at the students who did start the video, and we see no evidence of increased attention among those who did watch. It's not like those students were watching more. So let's focus on the students who were disengaged. What were they like, and what happened there? Okay, so we had a whole bunch of moderator analyses. I mean, we don't just run the many classes study to be able to find out what an overall global effect is. We also look at all the different properties of the individual classes to try and find out whether we can ascertain why the effect might be bigger or smaller in different places. And we find that classes with more difficult pre-questions had smaller overall benefits. We also find that students with more prior knowledge seem to get bigger benefits. So there are these two clear moderators. Students who already knew about relevant content benefited more. Students with low prior knowledge saw less benefit and sometimes disengaged entirely. This is what we would call a rich get richer effect, exactly what we don't want in education interventions, where it's only the students who already have some basic prior knowledge who seem to benefit from an intervention. And while that might lead to a global effect that seems to be good, 5% improvement, it's exactly what you don't want to have happen, because there's this equity implication that's being masked by the global improvement. There's a minority of students for whom there isn't any effect, and in fact, some evidence of disengagement. So this isn't just about comparing between the lab and the classroom. You can study heterogeneity in the lab, and you can also fail to study heterogeneity in classrooms. This is about a single streetlight versus a broadly illuminated terrain. So a single streetlight study, whether it's in the lab or the classroom, control the conditions so that things are uniform. They illuminate one spot really clearly with a single implementation with materials that have been custom designed for this that might have been used in other studies before, that have one difficulty level, that have one population, and that you can estimate an average effect and make comparisons with past studies. But these studies can't show how the landscape varies. So broadly illuminated studies, on the other hand, can systematically vary contexts to reveal heterogeneity. They show us where the effect thrives and where it seems to not thrive, where it struggles. So the single spotlight told us that pre-questions work on average, but the illuminated terrain gives us a better perspective of where and for whom pre-questions work. I want to say very clearly, both are valuable. We need both. But if we want to make recommendations for diverse educational contexts, we need the broadly illuminated view so that we're not kind of just fibbing about the practical benefits that a teacher might expect. So instead of saying teachers use pre-questions, I think instead we should say something like use pre-questions before instruction only when students have some relevant prior knowledge and when those questions are accessible enough that most students can engage productively, that it doesn't turn students off to the topic. And I want to say, I don't think this undermines the recommendation. I think it makes it stronger. Teachers can now make informed decisions about implementation. They can understand whether a thing might work in their classrooms. And we avoid inadvertently widening achievement gaps. So this is how we avoid contributing to misinformation, not by trying to make simple claims that are going to be cutting and hype-worthy and that teachers will just instantly do, but instead by being precise about scope and benefit. But you don't have to take my word for it. One of my favorite articles is by Mickey Chi down there. Mickey Chi argues that we should not be advertising effective practices, which might come as a shock to everybody in this room that believes that cognitive psychology is responsible for identifying effective practices. Instead, Mickey Chi says that we should be offering insight, that what we ought to do is create models of how improvement happens, test it at scale. And in fact, one of the implications of Mickey Chi's claim is that maybe this is why learning styles persists, and maybe this is why growth mindset seems to be so influential, because it offers a model or a framework with which a teacher might understand better what their students might be going through. Even if it's wrong, it has, as Valerie said, something like the gist of an understanding that makes sense to them. And maybe we should be doing that as scientists as well. This is exactly how we maintain public trust that open science depends on. Okay, it was hard to run a many classes study. We needed a lot of awesome people to be involved, but it was made feasible by the fact that we now have educational technology that makes this a little bit more possible. So this study used Terracotta. Terracotta is a learning management system plugin for embedding experiments in authentic course sites. It plugs into the Canvas learning management system, but I can say this publicly now that we're going to have a release for Brightspace if you guys use Brightspace. It handles consent and randomization and data exports, and nowadays you could even build an experiment in one class and export the experiment so that another teacher could import the same thing and not need to set it up separately. And what it does is it makes it practical to run studies across multiple classes, but also it makes it easy to run studies in your own class. It's all open sourced and free. It's IES funded, and if you're interested to learn more, you can go to terracotta.education. So the barrier isn't technical anymore. It becomes more cultural. If we care about not contributing to misinformation, what we need to do is embrace the messiness of learning and where it actually happens, and not instead of lab work, but with it. And the next speaker will tell you more about Terracotta. So I want to end by saying that we can't avoid studying under streetlights, but we can use more lights. We can illuminate the terrain where students are learning, and I really strongly believe that our credibility depends on understanding the scope of our claims. Thank you so much.
Okay, the short title for my talk is Smartwatches in the Wild. The longer title in the program is Smartwatch Learning Reinforcements in the Wild, using the Terracotta tool to rigorously examine a real-world classroom implementation. So as Ben said, I'm going to be talking a bit about the Terracotta tool that I mentioned in the title there. The Terracotta tool is a freely available plugin for the Canvas learning management system, as Ben Motes just mentioned. What it does is it enables an instructor to embed an experiment within the learning management system in order to carry out an experiment in the actual class setting on the effectiveness of a potential intervention. The Terracotta tool carries with it many useful features that enable a researcher to carry out both rigorous experiments in the classroom while at the same time being ethical in how they go about doing so. So I've highlighted a few of these features here in these icons. On the far left is the anonymous research consent process within Canvas. So the Terracotta tool enables an instructor to create an assignment in Canvas that is a consent form. And it does this anonymously such that students complete this as an assignment, but the instructor doesn't see how they responded, only that they responded. So which students in the class consented to have their data used in research and which did not is not visible to the instructor. And that leads me to the second icon there, which is that all students have the same course opportunities in the class. So all students are treated the same. They're all participating the same way because the instructor doesn't know who's participating in the research study and who's not. The third icon, the far one on the right, highlights how the terracotta tool enables a crossover experimental design to be used and random assignment to counterbalancing conditions within the course structure. And so crossover experimental design is very important from an ethical standpoint, because if you have reason to hypothesize that a learning intervention is likely to work, you wouldn't want to deprive some students of the opportunity to receive that intervention. And so with a crossover experimental design, all students receive all levels of your independent variable that you're manipulating. So everybody is getting this equal opportunity. And random assignment to counterbalancing conditions enables a level of rigor that's often difficult in real classroom settings or in the wild of the classroom. So I'm going to talk here about how we use the terracotta tool to go from the lab to the world in an investigation of the use of smartwatch prompts as potential learning reinforcers. And so I'm going to start with what we did in the lab. In 2021, my colleagues and I published this article on wearable technology for automatizing science-based study strategies, reinforcing learning through intermittent smartwatch prompting. This was a laboratory-based study published in JARMAC. Again in 2021. And what we did in this study was we carried out 5 experiments in the lab that followed the same general methodology. So that methodology was that in a first phase, participants read 4 scientific passages. These were one about evolution, one about the ice age, one about volcanoes, and one about food allergies. These came from prior research that's cited there at the bottom. And they had a half an hour in this first phase to read through these passages, and then they had a retention interval, which was a 1-hour break. And at the start of that 1-hour break, they were fitted with a smartwatch. That smartwatch would prompt them throughout that hour by tapping their wrist to alert them to look at the watch face at what's being displayed on the watch face. And during that period of an hour, when they're receiving these intermittent smartwatch prompts, they had a stack of magazines, and they could select from among those magazines which magazines to read during that time as their primary task. Then at the end of that hour, participants were given a multiple choice test meant to test their knowledge of the content of the scientific passages that they had read about in the first phase. So a central question that we'd had in that article was, does distributed testing via smartwatch confer an advantage or advantages over distributed restudying on a smartwatch? And so I'm going to highlight just a couple experiments out of that paper. In experiment 2 of that paper, participants were randomly assigned to either a restudy prompt condition or a retrieval practice prompt condition. In the restudy prompt condition, the prompts appeared as just restatements of facts from the scientific passages that the participants had read in that first phase. So it might say 12 plates make up the Earth's crust when a prompt would appear. And every 5 minutes, they're getting another prompt like this. In the retrieval practice condition, they're instead getting the prompt in the form of a question. How many plates make up the Earth's crust, for example? They don't have to do anything or respond out loud. They're just to think about it in their own head about whether they know the answer, and if so, what it is. Then a minute later, they receive feedback as to what the answer was. So a minute later, they'd see 12 as the answer to that preceding question. Here are the data from that experiment. As you can see, being prompted on material during that 1-hour interval leads to better final test performance than not being prompted. But of interest is that the retrieval practice prompt condition led to significantly higher performance on that final test than the restudy prompt condition. So retrieval prompts were a bit better at reinforcing learning. I want to highlight experiment 4, where we examined whether this pattern would hold up across a 2-day delay. So if we wait 2 days before giving that final multiple choice test, do we still see this pattern? Participants were randomly assigned to either an immediate or 2-day delayed final test. We also examined, in this particular experiment, a more engaging primary task than just reading magazines. We instead had participants select a Netflix episode, and they got to watch a Netflix episode for that hour while they're being prompted on that smartwatch. They got to choose from among a number of options like The Office or Parks and Recreation, so there were a number of episodes they could choose from. And here are the data from that experiment. As you can see, we again found that Final test performance was better for content that had been prompted with retrieval practice prompts than for content that had been prompted with restudy prompts. And that pattern held up after a 2-day delay. So even when that final test wasn't given until 2 days after their time in the lab, we still saw that pattern. So in summary, in the lab, smartwatch prompts consistently boost retention of information. Retrieval practice prompts followed by feedback were better than restudy prompts, and the retention boosts persisted across a 2-day delay. So I want to turn now to the question of, will these findings persist in a real-world classroom setting? So how we're using the terracotta tool that Ben Motes introduced and that I described earlier to go from the lab to the world to investigate, is this really an intervention that would work in the wild of an actual classroom setting? And so here, the wild, or the actual classroom setting, is my own science of learning class. It's a 100-level class at Colorado State University that is aimed at teaching students basics of the science of learning in ways that can help them develop better study strategies. So it's students in my own course where we're testing this out. And the way that we're doing this, taking it from the lab to the world, is that I was able to get a small amount of funding from Colorado State University to purchase enough smartwatches to loan an Apple Watch to every student in my science of learning class who doesn't already have one of their own and who would like to participate. So that's a box of smartwatches in each round container. If I were to pull one up, it looks like that. So they're round containers, they have the smartwatch on a little platform, and the charger is underneath that. And so they can carry it around with them. It comes, when they receive a smartwatch loan, they get this whole package of the charger and the watch in this container. So the terracotta tool that I mentioned earlier is what we're using to employ our experimental design. And I should mention that for all the wonderful features that I pointed out before that terracotta entails, it cannot actually go outside of the learning management system. So it operates within the confines of the Canvas learning management system for me, meaning that it cannot directly send messages to devices. So that is not the way that we're able to test out our experiment for whether smartwatch prompts work in the wild as a real classroom. Instead, what you're going to see here is an example of a creative use of terracotta. So I hope that you take away from this that you can be creative and figure out ways of employing complex experiments that require going outside of the confines of the Canvas learning management system with the terracotta tool. So the way that we employed our study design was to have the terracotta tool randomly assign students to a list of Google Calendar options. So students are basically randomly assigned to one of 3 counterbalancing conditions by the terracotta tool. And what they do then is they're subscribing to a spaced prompting calendar via the Google Calendar. This allows some degree of customization where students pick a schedule for prompting throughout the semester that works for them. And so the way that looks in Canvas, here you see the invitation to participate in research. That's the consent assignment through Terracotta that's anonymized. The subscribe to a calendar is an assignment that I created using the Terracotta tool to have students click on to then be taken to a page that looks like this. Now Terracotta is randomly assigning students to what they're going to see here. They all see the same names, so they get different schedules presented on the links, like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9 to 10 a.m., or Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 10 to 11 a.m., and so on. But the links take them to a different place depending on what counterbalancing condition they were randomly assigned to. And by different place, I mean a different Google Calendar set of options. And so from the student perspective, this is what it looks like in Google Calendar. So let's say this student subscribed to a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 2 to 3 p.m. calendar. They're going to get, during those hours, an analog to what I just talked about doing in the lab in the 1-hour retention interval. So each of those little purple colors there is a prompt that comes up, and it comes up every 4 minutes. For the student throughout that hour. From my perspective, I see more like this because I have lots of different calendar schedules. There are many more options than what I was able to display there. There are Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday options. So I see something more like this. And what I do is I program in Google Apps script code to deploy the prompts to the calendars for the students. So there are 3 within subjects conditions. There are the retrieval practice prompts, restudy prompts, and no prompts. And importantly, the prompts are counterbalanced by topic area. So every student has equal opportunity to receive all of the conditions. So for example, person 1 might receive retrieval practice prompts on topic 1, but restudy prompts on topic 2, and no prompts on topic 3, whereas person 2 might receive retrieval practice prompts on topic 1, restudy prompts on topic 3, no prompts on topic 1, and then person 3 would get the flip of all of that. This is an example prompt for the retrieval practice prompt condition. So one of the prompts that might come up during a given hour might look like this in the retrieval practice condition. An art history professor would like students to learn to recognize artist styles from new paintings, a form of inductive learning. What is the best way to present example paintings by a single artist? Then 1 minute later, they might get the feedback, intersperse paintings from different artists among one another so that no artist paintings appear adjacent to one another. In the restudy condition, they instead get a statement that conveys the same information, and it's just a statement of that information for them to look at. And then in the no prompt, the control prompt condition, when participants are assigned for a given topic area to the control condition where they're not receiving a prompt for that topic area, they are instead, it's not that they're not getting prompt, they're getting prompt, but they're instead getting prompt on earlier material from the first 3 weeks of class in preparation for the cumulative final exam that happens at the end of the class. And so everybody's always getting prompted, and everybody's getting equal exposure to all of the different prompt conditions. This is just what that might look like if I were to hover over one of those prompts. It's the start of a question, and then a minute later you can see at 2:07 p.m. the answer to that question, transfer appropriate processing, appears. So there are 12 topics altogether. It's a course on science of learning, so you might recognize a lot of the different topics. So every week it's a different topic being prompted according to their prompting schedule. So these are the results that we're finding so far, and I should mention these are the results from just the first semester that we've been able to complete using this tool. This study is still ongoing, so we're actually running it this semester. We're hoping to get multiple semesters and a much larger sample size than what I have here. This is our first consented group of a completed semester, which is only 26 participants, but we are finding a statistically significant difference there, where in the retrieval practice condition, that's where we're seeing a significant boost in terms of topic area cluster scores across all of the different exam clusters from the entire semester. Retrieval practice prompts are leading to higher cluster scores than the other two conditions. Interestingly, if I just look at the essay questions themselves, now there are only 6 essay questions, so it's not a huge number of items, it's not a huge number of subjects yet, but we're seeing the same pattern holding up so far with essay questions. So it's not just multiple choice questions where this pattern seems to be taking place. So, in conclusion, outside of class time, smartwatch prompts can potentially boost retention of course information. Again, this study is ongoing. It's going to take multiple semesters to accumulate a large body of data from the world of a real class. And it looks like the method of prompting matters, that retrieval practice, getting a question, the prompting in the form of a question followed by the answer is a better form of prompting than just restudying a factual piece of information across time. I want to also point out that the terracotta tool can help researchers go from the lab to the world in studying the effectiveness of specific implementations. So as Ben pointed out in the prior talk, we can't be certain if a finding from the lab is going to generalize to a specific way of implementing that finding with real students in a real classroom. And so this tool really presents an opportunity for researchers to test out specific implementations in real classes with real students. And I also hope that you take away from this that the terracotta tool can also be used creatively to employ research designs that do not necessarily fit within the confines of the learning management system. So what we did was a way of using the tool for what it's strong in, like anonymized consent and randomization, random assignment to counterbalancing conditions, while also taking our study outside of Canvas. We're not measuring their quiz performance within Canvas or assignment performance. We're examining the effects of these smartwatch prompting conditions on their exam scores throughout the course. And so that is what I have. I think we were saving questions for the end, and so I think I'll invite all of our speakers to come up and we can all take questions.
We know there's people out there. We hear breathing. Go ahead.
Go for it.
Get a photo of this.
Hi there, Sydney DeMello, University of Colorado, Boulder. I appreciated all the comments, though a little disappointed in the nature of the discourse, calling colleagues' research crappy and snake oil sales and so on. I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on how do we get education folks and cognitive folks to work together in productive ways? I've served on IES panels, National Science Foundation, Science of Learning Centers, and this tension is not new. How do we go beyond it?
I guess I apologize for the crappy comments and all that. I mean, a lot of that's for humor, but I think it is a real serious issue in terms of the disconnect between some of the folks who work in education and those who work in cognitive science. There does seem to be a disconnect. And you're right, Sydney. I don't think poking fun, calling snake oil, things like that is probably the best approach. But eventually we have to come to some sort of agreement in terms of, are we going to trust science, or are we going to go with kind of whatever is easy to understand for a gist, whatever model there is that's easiest to understand? I think the onus on us as researchers, like has been discussed, is to make sure that we package whatever intervention in a format that K-12 teachers or university instructors can easily implement, because a lot of times it's too damn complicated, and again, we don't talk about boundary conditions. And I'm going to shut up if anybody else wants to jump in.
I guess I can jump in. I think on that note, the first talk by Valerie Reina on the importance of gist in communication, I think we can look toward that literature and those models for ideas about how can we better communicate what does work in a way that is accessible and easily communicated. I think we should be looking there, while at the same time being careful that when we use that approach and we hopefully in the future get better at communicating what works and what doesn't, that we're certain that what we're communicating really does work, that we've tested it in for example, Ben Motz's approach of the many lights, that we've really thoroughly tested it in the wild of the real world as a specific implementation before recommending it in ways that we're using our own science to get to stick, basically.
And just as a footnote, I think you're right about the ad hominem. And I think we all have to, I think some of the events of what's happened recently, in part, not in whole, have to do with some of the excesses at that level in our own field. And I think we have to take that seriously. Even when the ad hominem speculations, and I'm not calling you out, I think you gave a great talk. I'm saying in general in our field, we need to, even when we think they're true, we need to focus on the science and the substance and not on the ad hominem parts of it. And when we think about the gray literature, for example, that's work that's not published. There's many, many reasons why it might not cohere with peer-reviewed published articles, some of which have to do with bias. We don't know. We don't actually have any scientific evidence for that. We just know that they're not agreeing. So the question then is why? Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Hello. Thank you for the presentation, all of you. My question is for Alex, actually. So in real life, bigger is not always better, and some interventions, some stimulus may not have monotonic effect. For example, arousal, too much is bad, too little is bad, the sweet spot is at the middle. Could it be true for the growth mindset? Maybe there is some, I don't know, I have no skin in the game, but instead of dividing growth mindset into fixed versus full growth, maybe is there a middle ground? Maybe there is a nonlinear relationship that the analysis doesn't account for.
That's a really nice point, Gozde. Thanks for the question. I suppose it's certainly possible. To me, it comes across as a little bit more theoretical flexibility and another researcher degree of freedom. I think it would be very interesting to explore the question. I just worry that quantifying it could be challenging, finding the sweet spot for each person. Maybe it's a moving target per individual. and that becomes very difficult to falsify. And one of the big themes that I took away from all this work on growth mindset was just the challenge to falsification. Even with all of the weight of the evidence, the proponents are still marketing their products and profiting off of them. And, you know, that can lead to some frustration because this discourse in the literature, it ends up being a back and forth with the same people that are profiting off of the construct. And so, I agree that we want to be careful with our discourse. I also feel like some of my discourse might come from my frustration just in this research world, trying to show this evidence and it either being ignored or rebutted, but maybe not in an appropriate way. And, it leads me to feel like sometimes calling a spade is the best way to be direct about it. So it's an interesting question about, is there a sweet spot for the right amount of growth mindset messaging? It's another moderator that can be examined, and it could be true. I guess we'll have to see. Thanks.
So I came in, George Soror, Dickinson State University. I came in skeptical of some of these talks, and I found them actually very compelling, so very well done. I think one of the reasons that Carol Dweck's work is so compelling was actually illustrated in one of the later talks, that pre-questions caused those people who already did not have knowledge to disengage further. Do you follow what I'm saying? In other words, the idea is, how do we reach these students that are already not very confident? And how the growth mindset idea seems plausible and seems like a way to reach these students who just decide to give up. And so, which was illustrated again in the later talk. So any thoughts on that in terms of empirically validated work?
I do have some thoughts on that. Actually, Dan Robinson and I are working on a paper right now where we're trying to make the case that growth mindset interventions may not be useful as standalone interventions. And so maybe you can't, if you're going to train someone to have a growth mindset, you can't train them to have that and then stop there and expect that to move the dial in terms of academic performance. And so there are some hints out there in the literature that perhaps growth mindset interventions sometimes may work, but indirectly insofar as they may help students develop a tolerance for the sense of struggle or the sense of difficulty that is involved in most effective learning interventions. So we know that the interventions that, at least in laboratory studies, are shown to work, they're the ones that students perceive to feel the least good, right? They feel difficult, they don't feel fluent, right? Testing instead of restudying, or spacing instead of massing. And so in this new paper we're working on, we're making the argument that instead of just training students on growth mindset and leaving it at that, we would like to see it coupled with training on effective learning strategies like retrieval practice, so that they come bundled together. And so you get trained in the growth mindset, but with this specific angle of teaching you to be tolerant of the sense of struggle and the sense of difficulty.
Yeah, many questions. I'll ask one that maybe all of you can respond to, which is, should I feel bad? So here's the reason. I was responsible in the 90s for the publication by Anders Ericsson of an article in Psych Review claiming that people could learn anything on the basis of studies of professional musicians in Germany. This was horribly flawed, confounded research drawing causal conclusions from correlations. But I argued that it ought to be published anyways on the basis that there seemed to be a predominant view in society that people were born with their abilities and couldn't change them and couldn't learn, which seemed completely at variance with everything we knew from learning in cognition and cognitive science. So I argued, managed to convince the editor and reviewers that it was worth publishing this, even though it was flawed, on the basis that there might prompt better research, real research, intervention research, but also that it might present a view that would be useful for society. So I'm wondering about whether that's true of some of the flawed research that has been described. Is there some merit for occasional flawed research if it has less than useful for society?
Okay, Rich. Yeah, you should feel bad. Yeah. I don't know. I've had many hallway conversations with Rich about this. I think that there's an important distinction to be made between being outward-facing about the process of science and being outward-facing about the products of science. So I don't know. I really like the idea that we ought to be able to share with the world the things that are coming out of our labs as they come out of our labs. I actually believe that science outreach makes the things that we do a lot more relevant to the world. But I think that there's something very dangerous about just saying we expect that science will correct itself when we get things wrong, because people might actually take up the things that we're saying we're doing, and that could have some potential harm to the students who are in the class, or it could change the way that they think the value of our products actually fit with society. So I think you're hitting at an interesting challenge of like, when is it good enough to say that this is something that should be public ready? And I think that the only way of getting around that, you know, we could have like a tribunal that like evaluates every claim that comes out of psychonomics and says this is public ready or this one's not. Another approach would just be to say that we should be a little bit more careful about the things that we say, and be more humble about the boundary conditions that are there. Yeah. I don't know. Does that help?
And I disagree. I think all of our research is flawed. And I think it's degrees of flawed. It's all going to be superseded. Everything we've said here is going to be someday. That's called progress. I think we've erred too much on, we have to have official, exact effect sizes, et cetera. I would suggest that we throw out the baby with the bathwater too often. And on the Carol Dweck work, on which I have no personal stake whatsoever, I should say, I think we have to say, when is it true and under what circumstances is it true? Is music, which has at least some genetic component, a little bit different than perhaps finishing the items on a standardized test? So there's some evidence that Dweck has presented that folks who have a growth mindset attempt more items and don't give up sooner, and that did change their scores on that test. That doesn't mean it's true everywhere for everyone in every circumstance. That's called theory revision and growth and progress, and ultimately those theories are revised and then are superseded.
Hi there. Firstly, I want to say thank you to all the speakers. Your talks were very thought-provoking, and I think the humor does help remind us about a point that was just made about science as being human and not perfect. We're all going to make mistakes sometimes. So my question is for the first and last speakers, Anne and Alex. So as educational psychologists, we want to help our students. And you mentioned this kind of oversimplification that we have with things like deliberate practice and grit alongside the growth mindset literature. So as an educator, I have observations from students who I see, again, observations, who I see have growth mindset that implement kind of these less hype strategies like retrieval practice, instead of strategies that just hide behind this kind of fluffy egalitarian name of growth mindset. So I think that I'd like if you could speak a little bit to the gap between the knowledge about persistence and resilience and implementing that resilience in the actual more underhyped and over-supported actual behavior of it. So if either Alex or Anne could speak a little bit more about maybe the last study that was mentioned about more behavioral measures of linking not only growth mindset interventions or linking growth mindset interventions with behaviors that actually work.
Yeah, and that's what I would like to see happen, is bundling a growth mindset training intervention with training on strategies that work. And an example of a strategy that works is retrieval practice over restudying. So study after study has shown that you're better off engaging in an attempt to retrieve information and getting feedback than restudying information. So I think if we bundled the growth mindset training with an intervention or with a training in a strategy that has evidence suggesting it's effective. And this evidence has been shown in classroom settings. So there's a great review paper on that showing retrieval practice versus restudy in the wild of classrooms. And so I think that might be one route, that we might not want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as Valerie said. There may be some good or some merit there, and perhaps the reason it doesn't move the dial in so many studies is that the people are just stopping there at the growth mindset training and not progressing further. And the reason I think that's important is what an effective learning strategy isn't intuitively obvious. That's why I'm teaching a class teaching students about the science of learning. What students feel is helping them is often at odds with what's really helping them. And so I do think we need to better train students not to follow their gut and their feelings, but to look towards scientific-based or science-based strategies. And so the first step would be not giving up as soon as you feel a sense of difficulty, right, or struggle with working on something. And so that's where I think, or I hypothesize, that training in a growth mindset first and then following it with training on a strategy that probably won't feel good, it will probably feel difficult, but learning to stick with it through that training in the growth mindset in this specific way might be an effective route in the future.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Just to build on that, yeah, I think some messages feel good. A growth mindset message definitely feels good. It's motivating, it's encouraging, it's what teachers want their students to feel when they're interacting with them. And that's not a bad thing. And maybe I missed that in my talk, but obviously we want to encourage students to achieve their full potential. We want them to, have the courage to persevere when challenged. I think those are all wonderful ideals. The gap is the growth mindset itself is not affecting academic achievement. So it sucks to be one of the people saying, hey, that doesn't work, or that alone isn't going to do it. And you can almost be demonized for going against the grain in this way. We want to believe in it. It goes along with our, cultural beliefs and ideals. So who am I to say it's ineffective? And why would I discourage all these students with a fixed mindset who just need a growth mindset? Well, maybe they need effective learning strategies too. And maybe receiving a growth mindset message which situates you as the agent with, all of the control over your outcomes, that feels good for a student to receive. And if that's all if the idea is that that's where it ends, that's just a happy feeling. And wouldn't you like to give that happy feeling to your students? Retrieval practice is hard. Deliberate practice is challenging. It's aversive. It's not enjoyable. Maybe it's more effective. And so there's this gap between how we want our students to feel and what we want them to accomplish, and I think it's a challenging gap to navigate. And often, maybe there's a people-pleasing component to this, where we want students to come away feeling better, not feeling like they have work to do, and this is the specific type of work they need to do if they want to get where they want to be. But I think we do need to be realistic about the effects of different interventions. And I think I'll just hang my hat on the point that, overstating the findings is going to lead people to false hope, and it's going to divert attention away from approaches that might have greater efficacy. And so when we're diverting funding resources away from things that could make a difference towards things that don't seem to make a difference on their own, but make students feel good, I feel like that's an issue. And when we're endorsing a theory that ignores so many of the other factors that we know matter, I think it does a disservice to all the other research out there that's finding larger effects and isn't getting picked up by the media, because there isn't a machine to spin those messages out. So I just feel like it's a challenging topic, and we have a lot of work to do, but yeah, thanks for your question.
We're gonna do one more. I know that we're not in a rush to get out of here, but we'll do one more, and then if you have questions or you'd like to ask us, you can catch us before we leave. So, Veronica, go ahead.
I wouldn't be offended if people really needed to leave, but so I'm Veronica Yan. I'm at UT Austin, so commiserations being in Texas. I'm in an interesting situation where I spend a lot of time doing professional development workshops with teachers. I've also been consulting with the Texas Education Agency over the last year or so. And an interesting development is that they've actually put in cognitive science of learning, spacing, retrieval practice, explicitly saying that learning styles are not a thing, adding in dual coding. They put that into their teacher certification standards. They also put that into their standards for high quality instructional materials. But the next challenge is how do we actually train people? So with these new standards, they've decided that they can only allot a single 2-hour workshop to training the trainers on these principles. And the problem is that a lot of these things are complex. It's not one size fit all, just do this. We know, and we've got our theories somewhat there. All of us are still constantly working on the theory and the boundary conditions. How do we effectively teach teachers to know how to appropriately apply? Because I think one of the challenges is that cognitive scientists, we qualify everything and we hold ourselves back. Whereas there are other people in the educational psychology field who immediately jump into those recommendations. We actually have a lot more solid evidence, but we are the ones not putting it out there quite as enthusiastically because we want to be careful. Other people might be over-promising and under-delivering. We are under-promising and we're not delivering.
And we're making a lot less money doing that, too.
And losing out on money.
Someone want to take that?
I don't know that we have a good answer to that, Veronica, but I like the question. One of the things that I've encountered when I talk with teachers is that they're constantly experimenting. They're just doing it in a not rigorous with randomized control trial sorts of way. And I think that teachers are accustomed to the concept of failure in that regard, that like they're frequently going to try something and then find out that it didn't work. So I don't know, one of my answers has been that we could be doing a much better job. Maybe this is a late answer to Sydney's question. We could be doing a better job actually collaborating with teachers as cognitive psychologists in the research that we're doing and involving them in it so that we're not treating them as consumers of research but rather active participants in it. And I think that that's one of the modes that we could adopt constructively because, again, as I've said and as Anna said, our laboratory studies aren't necessarily providing the types of clean prescriptions about what should actually work in a classroom setting. So if we have the constructive dialogue with the teacher to say, how would you set this up in your class? It might actually help us as cognitive psychologists get a little bit better on those things. As a funny anecdote, in the educational psychology publication, we had to write educational practices statement, just like what Dan was talking about for many classes, but I cheated. I said, instead of like writing it for educational practice implementations, I said that educational implementations could inform psychological science theory and that there's benefit in thinking about it as a two-way street. So, I don't know. I know you agree with all that, so it's kind of a funny thing to say in response. Yeah.
What a great question. I helped create IES, so I've thought about this for a long time. And I think there's a counterintuitive answer to this, and that is theory. Explaining the theory and why the results are observed, the nature of the underlying mechanisms. I'm not talking non-evidence-based theory. That's not what I mean by a theory. The evidence-based part. The most important thing to know how to generalize any practice in terms of different contexts is to know the underlying mechanisms of action. Then you know which of the parts of it are the active ingredient and which of the parts are irrelevant or trivial. The color of the walls, why they were doing the experiment may or may not be crucial to the nature of the mechanism. So trying to give people a sense of understanding of why it worked, not just that it worked, and why it worked for some people and why it did not work for others will help people then become empowered to generalize it to other contexts.